All right, everybody. So now we're on to round two. So obviously, in your sticky note analysis assignments, there's always two parts. The first thing you're always going to want to do is go through and knock out the purple sticky notes. And that's where you simply track what's going on in the story, like we just did in the previous video. You identify the main characters, you tell me what's happening, in each chunk. You don't got to go through paragraph by paragraph, but you do got to be able to track what's literally going on in the story, important story points, things of that nature. Because in order to analyze and to dig deeper and to make inferences about the story, which we're about to talk about, you have to first understand the story on a literal level. So after you went through and you've knocked out your purple stickies, you've given yourself kind of a summary along the left-hand side to use as you're digging deeper into the story. Then you're going to go back through each slide of the story and you're going to fill out your yellow sticky notes. And the yellow sticky notes, they're going to be the analysis sticky notes. All right, that's where you're going to really dig into what is actually happening, kind of, behind the curtain. You're really going to go deep, okay, as far as making inferences, looking at things like characterization and character motivation. What are the conflicts and how are those conflicts affecting the characters? Are there shifts in the story? Where do those shifts occur? How do they change the characters? Maybe important details about the setting that affect the characters or affect the theme. And you're also maybe going to point out some universal ideas as they pop up, some things you continually notice that the author might be trying to get you to see, some things the author might be trying to make you aware of. So like I said, step one, knock out your purple stickies to track what's happening. And now let's go through the same story, starting at the beginning, and we're going to use those purple stickies kind of as our guide to what we're going to dig deeper into in the yellow stickies. So let's do it. So we have the same purple stickies that we just went through here from the last video, but now we're going to try to dig into that stuff and make some inference, analyze some things, stuff like that. Now, for the first few of these sticky note analysis activities I'm going to have you do, I might post a lot of questions on the stickies that you need to answer, but the idea is that eventually you all should be able to read the story on your own and complete both sets of stickies on your own, meaning you should be able to track the story without any prompting along the left-hand side with the purple, and then you ought to be able to, come up with your own ideas for what you need to talk about over here in the yellow sticky notes without me, prompting you with questions. All right. Now that's, we got time to get good at that, to figure that out, because at this point, I don't imagine most of you know what questions to ask yourselves. So that's why I'm giving you the questions here at the beginning, because I want you to see the kind of questions I would like for you to focus on, the kind of things I would like you to dig into. So let's do it. First thing we did was we identified the setting, right? It's a rural setting. So one thing you might do in the yellow stickies is just think about, why is that rural setting important? What significance might it have ultimately for the story? So go ahead and tell me what you think. So for that first sticky, you could have said something along the lines of the rural setting is needed because obviously that's the boar's habitat, but the rural setting also gives the idea of like a close-knit community, and everybody kind of feels the same about the boar. Maybe that's why Jenny feels safe to go out into the woods all by herself, things of that nature. Now, we continue reading at the beginning, and we pick up a couple of character traits about Jenny. We kind of get an idea of what kind of child she is, and then we also get an idea of how she's imagining this boar, what she sees this boar to be. So maybe give me a couple of responses here. First off, tell me a couple of words that you would use to describe Jenny. What are her character traits? And then what do we notice here? How is she imagining this wild animal, which probably isn't at all what the wild animal is like? Go. So for character traits, you could have said anything along the lines of she's young, she's imaginative, she's creative, she's, very like she has a whimsical approach to the world, she's very fun loving, she's adventurous, anything of that nature would have worked. And then lastly, the way she imagines this boar, golden horn, it's going to rise up on its rear hooves, throw his head toward the stars, cry a long, clear, sure note into the air, would glide through the night and spear the heart of the moon. That's very whimsical. It's very magical and mythical, and it kind of sounds like a fairy tale in a way. So if you said something like that, pat yourselves on the back, because that is a pretty high level inference to make, a pretty high level thing to notice. Let's move on. So passage 2 is pretty short, but let's look at the first bit here. It says, one hot summer day she went to find the boar. No one in Glenmorgan had ever gone past the old black Dodge and beyond as far as she knew, but the boar was somewhere between those awful trees, and his dark green eyes waited for someone. Ginny felt it was she. So I have the question here, what's this remind me of? What kind of story does this passage sound like? What kind of beginning does this passage sound like? Maybe something you read as a child. Go. Now, if you said it sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale, we kind of hinted at that in the previous slide. Good job. Now, what do we pick up about Ginny here? How does she imagine herself? How does she view herself in this fairy tale that she's sort of concocting? What does she want to be? What do you think? Oops. All right, so I kind of screwed up the slides here, but if you said something like she wants to be the hero of the fairy tale, she wants to be brave, she wants to be adventurous, hey, all that works. Now, let's move on to the next slide, and hopefully I didn't screw up the presentation on this one. All right, so as we read this next passage, there's some more characterization. Ginny's kind of changing. At the beginning of the story, she seems very brave and strong, but as she gets closer and closer to the boar, things kind of change, right? So it says here in part 9, finally, leaning against a tree to rest, she heard him for the first time. She forgot to breathe, standing there listening to the stamping of hooves, and she choked and coughed. What might this reveal to us about Ginny? And what might this reveal to Ginny about herself? So if you said something along the lines of, it shows that she's scared and reveals that she might not be as brave as she thought she was, that's good, because that's the truth, right? In a story, in a narrative, typically the main character changes from beginning to end in some way, shape, or form. They learn something, they grow in some way, and she's changing. She's learning something about the world, something about, how maybe imagination and the way we picture things isn't always the way things are. Imagination versus reality. Maybe that's a universal idea in this story. Who knows? Now, we continue reading, and now the pounding was horrible, too loud and confusing for Ginny, horrible. She stood stiff with wet eyes and knew she could always pray, but for some reason, she didn't. So she's not even, she's so scared that she doesn't even pray, it says here. So what do you think this reveals to us about Ginny? What do you think this tells us about what she's learning, what she's realizing, how she's changing? This is a tough one, but give it a shot. So this confirms that, Ginny is changing from the hero of her fairy tale, how she imagined herself at the beginning. And, she understands how the world works. Her imagination kind of gets the best of her, and she knows how things are. But now that she's out on her own, she's looking for this boar. Things are a little bit scarier in the deep, dark woods. She's realizing that, maybe the way she's viewed the world isn't exactly how the world is, and things might be a bit scarier than she'd imagined. So once again, there's that universal idea, imagination versus reality. We can imagine the world to be the way we want it as much as we can, but that doesn't necessarily make it the way we want it to be. And she's kind of realizing that the hard way on this quest to find this wild animal in the woods. So let's continue. So here we have the climax of the story, and we talked about the climax in the previous video. This is where she finally sees the boar for the first time. And, she's imagined this boar to be this wild, this mythical creature with a golden horn, this beautiful animal, and this magical thing. But then she sees it, and she says the body was rigid. They traveled along his scarred, bristling back to his thick hind legs. Tears spilled and flooded her face. Ginny stared at the boar's ragged ears caked with blood. So she sees this thing, and it's not anything like she'd imagined. So we identified the climax. She cries as she notices all the boar's scars. Now in the yellow, you need to tell me what's significant about the climax. What is it that she's learning? What is it that's happening? What is it that she's realizing? How is she changing? Go. So the climax is important because it's where she comes face to face with what she's been searching for. She comes face to face with reality. She realizes that, imagination and reality are obviously two totally different things, and sometimes the world isn't what we hoped it to be. Things don't work out the way we would hope they would work out. And then there's a shift that occurs. And I'll go ahead and give you this one because you might have said this in your first post-it. The shift occurs in Jenny, the change occurs because the boar is not at all what she'd imagined. She sees it not as a grand beast, but as a scarred animal. So there once again is that universal idea, imagination versus reality. And sometimes whenever we, are kind of hit with reality over the head, it's not pleasant, it's not fun. And that's kind of happening to her. Imagination versus reality. And another universal idea you could be coming up with here is kind of coming of age, because this could also sort of be a metaphor for growing up, right? As children, we might view the world a certain way, but then when we get out into the world on our own, we might realize that how we'd imagined things to be aren't at all how things actually are. So she's learning a pretty valuable life lesson here, albeit it's kind of a crappy way to learn it. All right, the last passage. So high in the trees, a blue jay yelled, and suddenly it was over. Jenny stood like a rock as the boar wildly flung his head and terror bolted past her. So we said over here in our purple stickies that the sound of the blue jay scared the boar. So there's some characterization here of the boar, because the whole story, Jenny's been trying to convince herself and kind of convince the reader that this boar is a magical, mythical, powerful beast that rules the forest, right? So what do we notice here about the boar? What characterization are we given that, once again, brings us back to reality about the boar? Go. So if you said something along these lines, pat yourself on the back. It would seem like a boar wouldn't be afraid of a bird, but in reality, the boar was actually startled. So another, bash over Jenny's head, of the way she imagined things isn't always going to be the way things actually are. Imagination versus reality. And then lastly, the resolution we said was that Jenny felt sorry for the boar. She doesn't hold it, on a pedestal anymore. Now she kind of pities the poor thing. Now you need to dig into that. How has that experience affected her? How has that changed her? What did she learn from this? Go. All right, so if you said something like Jenny has matured through this experience, no longer seeing the boar as a fairy tale creature, but as an animal to be pitied, good job, right? Because that's what this story is about. The story is about coming to grips with the fact that, maybe as we grow up, we slowly start to see the world for what it really is. We start to see things for what they really are. And, the way we've imagined things might be, fun and fantastical, but that's not going to be how things always are. And it's a hard truth to learn. It's a hard reality to learn, but it's a part of growing up. So there's that imagination versus reality universal idea once again. Or, if you were looking at it through another lens, it could be a coming of age tale or a story about growing up, any of those things. But you notice that as we continually dug into the story, one particular universal idea kept popping up. How she imagined things was not at all the way things were. So now that you've identified that universal idea, then you ought to be able to go on and identify the theme of the story, or the lesson that the author was trying to teach you, which ultimately is the reason we go through this whole sticky note analysis process. You track the story in the purple stickies, you dig into the story in the yellow stickies, you analyze, you make inference, you focus on characterization and the things the characters do and say and why they're doing those things, why they're saying those things, how are they changing. And then through doing both sets of stickies, you should be able to identify universal ideas that'll help you identify ultimately the theme, the lesson, the message, the moral that the author is trying to get across to you. So the very last thing, I would like for you to tell me what it is that Jenny wanted. Ready, set, go. All right, pretty simple. She wanted to encounter the fantastic beast that she was imagining. Now, what was the conflict, though? What was the problem? What was the issue that she ran into? The issue was that she imagined the beast to be fantastic, but then when she actually saw it, she realized it was scared and sad and just ordinary. Now lastly, fill in the boxes below to show 5 key moments in the story. So you can go back. I have shared with you in Google Classroom a link to the slides that we've just went through. You can go back, look through your purple stickies, and you can use those to identify the 5 key moments. And then once you've identified them, fill them in your Ed puzzle. Ready, set, go. All right, let's see how close she got. Jenny imagines the boar as a mighty fairy tale beast with a golden horn. Jenny then decides to go out and find the boar. As she gets closer to the boar, she starts to become very scared because reality is setting in. When she finally sees the boar, she notices that it's scared and bloody and it's nothing like she'd imagined. And lastly, she goes home disappointed and continues to feel sad for the state that the boar lives in. All right, last thing, we're not going to do this, but I just want to show you, like I said, doing the sticky note analysis might seem kind of cumbersome. It might seem like a lot of extra work, but I promise you there is value in it. Because by going through that story, doing the purple stickies and the yellow stickies, reading the story multiple times, really digging into it, you're going to not only be able to track what's happening, to summarize the story easier, identify conflict and things like that, but it's going to make it easier for you to find universal ideas, which ultimately will help you find theme. Because really, the best way to find those things is to read a story more than once. Right? If you read a story one time, you're just basically reading it for the story. But every time you read a story after that first time, you'll pick up on new stuff. You'll pick up on new ideas. You'll catch things that you didn't catch the first time through because you already know what's going to happen. So you're reading deeper, you're reading closer. And that's the reason we do this. You could have identified any of these universal ideas as you read: imagination versus reality, the role that fear plays, in our lives as we grow up, coming of age, empathy, how we, kind of come to empathize with others. So there's probably others on here that you've maybe identified that aren't on this list. But finding those universal ideas is step one towards finding a theme, which is going to be one of the most important things that we learn how to do this year. Okay? So hopefully after watching these 2 videos and going through these 2 Ed puzzles, you have a better idea as to what I'm expecting when we knock out these sticky note analysis activities. And like I said, I don't expect you guys to be able to go through the whole thing all by yourselves, come up with your own questions to answer just yet. That's why I'm going to give you lots of guiding questions in the yellow stickies for the time being. But the goal is to eventually be able to give each of you individually a story with the sticky notes, and for you to be able to go through it and fill out the sticky notes all on your own without me having to help at all. That's the goal. That's what we should all be striving to get to. All right? So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I think you all are ready to tackle your first real sticky note analysis assignment, especially now that we know what's expected.